Kara Tolliver walked into Millstone High for the first time, her steps steady but cautious. There was no warm welcome, no curious whispers, just the quiet indifference of a school already settled into its routines. She was just another transfer student, arriving halfway through the semester, unnoticed and unimportant to everyone else. But that was fine. Kara had learned long ago that being invisible was safer. Her backpack was a little worn, her hoodie slightly oversized, and she moved with the careful awareness of someone who knew how to read a room before ever speaking. Coming from Detroit, Kara understood that standing out wasn't always a good thing. Her Uncle Reggie had drilled it into her, keep your head low, baby girl. Loud gets you noticed. Notice gets you trouble. It was a lesson she had never forgotten. But Millstone High was a world away from Detroit. The students here carried themselves with an effortless kind of confidence, their shoes spotless, their clothes expensive, their laughter ringing through the halls as if they had never known struggle. No one said anything to her directly, but she saw the glances, the flicker of eyes over her sneakers, the barely concealed smirks at her thrift store hoodie. In gym class, a girl with perfectly curled hair and glossy lips wrinkled her nose when Kara walked past, as if she had brought the wrong kind of air with her. Kara noticed, but she didn't react. She never did. At lunch, she sat alone at the back of the cafeteria, eating quietly while the room buzzed with conversations that had nothing to do with her. She wasn't lonely, she was used to this. It was easier to stay on the edges, to observe instead of participate. But that didn't mean she could escape them. A sharp voice cut through the noise, laced with amusement. "EW, what even is that? You bring that from home or something?" Kara looked up, her chewing slowing. The speaker was a tall, blonde girl in a cheerleading uniform, Madison Carter, queen of Millstone High and the kind of girl who had never heard the word no. She stood a few feet away, a smirk tugging at her glossy lips, with two other girls flanking her like they were her personal entourage. Kara didn't say anything. She had nothing to prove, and she knew better than to take the bait. But silence wasn't protection at Millstone High, it was an invitation. And Madison Carter wasn't the kind of girl to back down just because she didn't get the reaction she wanted. Madison sauntered forward, her heels clicking against the tiled cafeteria floor, the sound crisp and deliberate. She carried her tray with an air of practiced confidence, her polished nails tapping idly against the plastic as she approached. The smirk tugging at her lips deepened when her gaze landed on Kara's lunch, a modest meal, packed from home, nestled in a well-worn container. It was different from the perfectly portioned salads and expensive sandwiches that graced the trays of those around her. Different, and to Madison, different meant inferior. She stopped just beside Kara's table, tilting her head ever so slightly, her eyes flickering with amusement. "Oh my God," she murmured, just loud enough for her friends to hear. "What even is that?" Laughter rippled through the small group gathered behind her, a chorus of high-pitched giggles that rang through the cafeteria like a rehearsed performance. Their eyes flicked between Madison and Kara, eager to see what would happen next. Kara inhaled slowly through her nose, forcing herself to stay still, to keep her fingers from tightening around the fork in her hand. She had seen girls like Madison before, entitled, cruel for the sake of entertainment, girls who had never once known hunger or struggle. Girls who saw people like her as nothing more than an afterthought, a target. She had spent years perfecting the art of ignoring them, swallowing the words she wanted to say, forcing herself to be small so she wouldn't draw attention. But something about today, about the way Madison looked at her with thinly veiled disgust, like she wasn't worth the space she occupied, made something inside her snap taut. She lifted her gaze, meeting Madison's with a calm, unwavering stare. "It's food," she said, her voice level. "You know, the stuff people eat." For a split second, there was silence. Madison's smirk faltered, just barely, but it was enough. Enough for Kara to see the flicker of surprise in her eyes, the tiny misstep in her carefully curated performance. Then, just as quickly, Madison rolled her eyes, regaining her composure. "Right," she drawled, her voice laced with mockery. She wrinkled her nose and took a deliberate step back, as if the mere presence of Kara's lunch offended her. "Well, it smells disgusting." The laughter returned, a little louder now, emboldened by Madison's confidence. Her friends leaned into it, some covering their mouths as they giggled, others whispering to one another, their gazes flicking to Kara like she was some sort of spectacle. Kara could have ignored them. She could have let it go, taken a deep breath, and focused on her food like she had so many times before. But this time, the words were there before she could stop them. She leaned back slightly in her chair, her expression still composed, but her voice cut sharper than before. Must be nice, she mused, her tone deceptively light. Never having to appreciate a real meal. Guess when everything's handed to you, you forget how lucky you are. The air shifted. The table nearest them went silent, and a few students turned their heads, sensing the tension coiling in the space between them. The reaction was instant. Madison's lips parted, her brows twitching together for the briefest second. It wasn't rage, not yet, but irritation. Annoyance. Like she wasn't used to being challenged. Like she didn't like it one bit. Kara didn't smirk. She didn't gloat. She simply held Madison's gaze, refusing to shrink away, refusing to break. For a moment, Madison looked like she might fire back, like she might bare her teeth and lash out, demand the control she had just lost. But then, with a huff of feigned indifference, she flipped her hair over her shoulder, plastering a look of boredom onto her face. Whatever, she muttered, turning away. Come on, let's go. Her friends followed quickly, their laughter returning, but it was different now. Forced. Hollow. As they disappeared into the crowd, Kara exhaled slowly, releasing the tension from her shoulders. She knew this wasn't the end. Girls like Madison never let things go. There would be more comments, more whispers, more attempts to put her in her place. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel small. She didn't feel invisible. She picked up her fork again, her fingers steady. And for the first time since she had walked through the doors of Millstone High, she felt something close to victory. As the lunchroom gradually returned to its usual hum of chatter, the clatter of trays and laughter filling the air, Kara sat frozen in her seat, her pulse still thrumming from the confrontation. The adrenaline that had surged through her moments ago was beginning to ebb, leaving behind a strange mix of exhilaration and unease. She had spoken up, had finally pushed back against Madison's cruelty, but instead of feeling triumphant, she felt the weight of what had just happened settle heavily in her chest. She picked up her fork, stabbing absent-mindedly at the food on her tray. The meal that had once looked appetizing now seemed unappealing, as if the tension from earlier had drained her appetite. She couldn't shake the memory of Madison's sharp, cutting glare, the way her lips had curled in that venomous smirk before she'd sauntered off. Kara knew that look. It was the kind that promised retaliation. Across the table, Jordan shifted in her seat, watching Kara carefully before nudging her tray forward slightly. That was, she hesitated, her voice lower than before. Intense. Kara let out a slow, measured breath, dropping her fork onto the tray with a soft clink. Yeah, she muttered, rubbing the side of her temple as if trying to ease the tension building there. I guess it was. Jordan leaned forward, propping her elbows on the table. I mean, I've never seen anyone shut Madison down like that before. A smirk tugged at the corner of her lips. Kinda legendary. Kara scoffed under her breath, shaking her head. Legendary? She shot Jordan a skeptical glance, but there was no mockery in her friend's expression, only genuine admiration. Jordan shrugged. I'm serious. Most people just let her walk all over them. But you? You didn't back down. Kara pressed her lips together, unsure how to respond. It was true, she hadn't backed down. And yet, the victory didn't feel as satisfying as she had imagined. Maybe because she knew Madison. Knew how people like her operated. Standing up to her once wouldn't be enough. If anything, it had only made Kara a bigger target. She swallowed hard, glancing toward the far side of the cafeteria where Madison and her friends sat in a tight-knit huddle, their heads bent close together. She could almost hear the hushed whispers, the plotting, the subtle shifts of their expressions as they exchanged glances in her direction. The unease in Kara's stomach deepened. Madison's not going to let this slide, she murmured, more to herself than to Jordan. Jordan followed her gaze and rolled her eyes. She never lets anything slide unless she's the one winning, she said, then popped a chip into her mouth. After a thoughtful pause, she added, but honestly? Who cares? You didn't let her win today. Kara exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening around the edge of her tray. Maybe Jordan was right. Maybe, in some small way, she had won. Not by humiliating Madison, not by overpowering her, but by refusing to let fear dictate her actions. But as she watched Madison lean back in her chair, a slow, calculating smile spreading across her face, Kara felt a cold shiver run down her spine. This wasn't over. Not even close. The rest of the lunch period crawled by at an agonizingly slow pace, each second stretching uncomfortably long as the weight of what had just happened refused to fade. The cafeteria buzzed with the usual noise, chatter, laughter, the scrape of plastic trays against tables, but to Kara, it all felt distant, like she was hearing it through water. Her pulse still hadn't settled, her fingers tightening and loosening around the edge of her tray in an attempt to shake off the lingering adrenaline. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't ignore the phantom sensation of Madison's stare pressing against her skin. She hadn't looked back once, hadn't dared to, but she knew. Knew with that instinctive certainty that came from being prey under the watchful eyes of a predator. She's still watching, isn't she? Kara muttered, keeping her voice low as she stared at the untouched food on her tray. Across from her, Jordan leaned back in her seat, sipping lazily from her soda, but her sharp eyes flicked in Madison's direction before settling back on Kara. Yep, she confirmed, her tone light, almost amused, though Kara could hear the edge beneath it. Kara swallowed, forcing herself to breathe evenly. Great. Jordan set her cup down and tilted her head slightly. You do realize this isn't over, right? Madison doesn't do casual warnings. She plots. She waits. And then she makes sure it hurts. Kara's stomach twisted. She already knew that. The moment Madison had walked away without a comeback, without some final sharp-edged remark, Kara had known this was far from finished. Madison never left things unresolved. That silence hadn't been defeat, it had been calculation. Still, she squared her shoulders, forcing a steadiness into her voice that she wasn't sure she truly felt. Let her plan whatever she wants, she said. I'm not going to be scared of her. Jordan studied her for a moment, eyes narrowing as if trying to determine how much of that bravado was real. Then, with a smirk, she leaned in slightly. Damn right you're not. Kara wanted to believe that was enough, that standing her ground would mean something, would make a difference. But even as the lunch bell rang and students began shuffling toward the exits, that sense of unease gnawed at her ribs. Unable to stop herself, she finally risked a glance across the room. Madison was already on her feet, arms crossed, her weight shifted onto one leg in that effortlessly confident way she always stood. But it was the expression on her face that made Kara's blood run cold, the slow, knowing smirk, the slight arch of her brow. She wasn't angry. She wasn't fuming. She was amused. And that was so much worse. Madison held Kara's gaze for just a second longer, then tilted her head ever so slightly, an almost imperceptible gesture, one that sent a clear, unspoken message. Asterisk I see you. I'm not done, asterisk. Then, with that same maddening smirk, she turned and disappeared into the crowd, swallowed by the river of students heading the class. Kara let out a slow breath, but the tightness in her chest remained. This wasn't over. Not even close. The rest of the day crawled by at an agonizing pace, each second feeling like an eternity. Kara tried to focus, tried to keep her mind on her assignments, but her thoughts kept spiraling back to the encounter with Madison. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that smirk, that knowing, taunting expression that sent a chill down her spine. She wasn't just imagining things. The way people glanced at her in the hallways, the way whispers seemed to follow her, it wasn't paranoia. Something was happening, something she couldn't see yet, and the not knowing made her chest tighten with unease. By the time the final bell rang, Kara felt like she had been holding her breath all day. The second she stepped out of her last class, she exhaled, trying to shake off the weight pressing against her ribs. She moved quickly, weaving through the crowd of students eager to leave, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. At her locker, she yanked it open, shoving her books inside with more force than necessary. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe this was just another one of Madison's mind games, an attempt to get inside her head, to make her afraid before anything even happened. Or maybe this was just the beginning. Hey, Jordan's voice cut through her thoughts, light but observant. You look like you just walked out of a horror movie. Kara forced a short laugh, though it felt hollow. Yeah, well, let's hope I make it to the end credits. Jordan smirked, but her eyes studied Kara a little too closely, like she was trying to gauge just how serious she was. Kara didn't want to talk about it. Not here. Not with so many ears listening. The two of them pushed through the crowded hallway together, stepping out into the warm afternoon air. The heat of the sun baked the pavement, the smell of asphalt thick in the air. Students milled around the parking lot, some chatting in small groups, others unlocking their cars or pulling out their phones. It was a normal scene. Too normal. And yet, Kara couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her steps slowed. Across the lot, leaning lazily against the hood of a sleek black car, was Madison. She wasn't looking directly at Kara, but everything about her posture said she was waiting. Waiting to be noticed. Waiting for Kara to react. A slow, crawling dread twisted in Kara's stomach. Madison always knew how to play this game. She thrived on it. The subtle intimidation, the quiet threats wrapped in nothing but a look. And Kara hated how easily it worked, how even now, her pulse had started to pick up, her muscles tensing instinctively. Kara squared her shoulders and forced herself to keep walking, but her grip on her backpack strap tightened until her knuckles ached. Then, just as if on cue, Madison finally lifted her gaze, locking eyes with her. A smirk tugged at the corner of her lips. Slowly, deliberately, she pulled out her phone, tapped the screen a few times, and then, still smirking, lifted it slightly, just enough for Kara to see. A second later, Kara's own phone buzzed in her pocket. She felt the vibration like a jolt of electricity against her hip, but she didn't move right away. She didn't want to give Madison the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, she kept walking, jaw clenched, stomach twisting tighter. Madison, of course, looked amused by her restraint. She leaned in toward one of her friends, whispered something, and then, just like that, turned on her heel and strolled away. As if she hadn't just sent a message loud and clear. Kara didn't check her phone until she reached her car. With a deep breath, she unlocked it, her thumb trembling slightly as she swiped through her messages. One new text. No name. Just an unknown number. Her chest tightened as she opened it. You should have stayed quiet. For a long moment, Kara just stared at the screen, her pulse roaring in her ears. A cold chill crept down her spine. So, this wasn't just in her head. It wasn't just a mind game. This was real. And it was only just beginning.